Which takes us to number 2. To discern correctly, we don't need to only realize that it's a spiritual world and a supernatural world. We need to realize that there are deceiving voices. 1 John 4, 1 and 3 says this, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you've heard was coming and is now in the world already." Here's what John says. John says you need to realize that there are spirits that are actively trying to deceive you. There are spirits that are actively trying to deceive you here, now, and today. They're trying to do that. He says, and here's what I mean by that. I'm not saying that normal deceit isn't just happening. See, deceit happens all the time on a regular basis. You see, my kids try to deceive me often by telling me, well, Mom said that I could do this. To which my response is, that doesn't really sound a lot like your mom. I'm going to go ahead and verify that. That's just something that happens. What I'm saying is there are people that are actively in the same spirit trying to deceive you. It's the actual spirit of the Antichrist. It's against God. And so, what I want to do is walk you through the main ways that false prophets tend to deceive. Okay, the way that false prophets tend to deceive and how we end up being deceived. You can write these down. They're not there in your notes, but you can write it off the side. The first way is this: excitement. The very first way is excitement. Sometimes you have a false prophet that gets up and is a great communicator and people are all excited and coming along and there's big giant crowds of people. There's energy, and so you go there and you see it and you check it out and go, man, this has to be true because look at this big crowd and look at this excitement and look at all this stuff that's going around this. This has to be a good thing. Now hear me, there's nothing wrong with excitement. I want excitement. I want excitement for Jesus. I want excitement for these things. But I'm saying excitement can't be the litmus test that we say, well, if there's excitement, it must be true and it must be right. If there's passion, boy, it must be correct. There's a lot of passion that is dead wrong. And so the very first way that we see deception occurring is through the excitement that is there. The second way that we tend to see deception that occurs, false teachings, false prophets, is this. It's the word experience. Experience. You hear a teacher get up and say, well, this is my experience. This is what happened to me. And because it happened to me and because it worked for me, then it's going to work for you and it must be for you. And so they talk about their experiences. This is where you start to hear some people say these words, well, this is my truth. Now, church, I love you enough to say this. There's no such thing as your truth. There is truth, and that's it. It's not subjective. And so when you get somebody getting up and saying, well, this is my truth, and this is what had worked for me, and they're not talking about the Bible, and they're not opening up the Scriptures and doing those things, we need to be aware this very well could be a false prophet, a fake teacher. Now, again, experiences are not bad. It is wonderful for you and I to have this thing called a testimony, to say, this is what God did in my life. Nothing wrong with experiences, but experiences cannot be the end all. And say, well, because they had this experience, it must be 100% true. All right, third one, and the one that is probably the rarest but also still occurs, is this: the extraordinary. The supernatural. Here's what I mean. Let's go Old Testament for a minute. Moses shows up on the scene. He goes to Pharaoh. And God says, I want you to do a couple signs and show the miraculous. So Moses goes ahead and he does some miraculous things, like throwing his staff on the ground, turns into a snake, things like that. I want you to remember this truth. The magicians who had no relationship with God whatsoever could do the exact same extraordinary things. Which is kind of funny because they were doing the things that also hurt Pharaoh and hurt their own people. They were like, well, we can do this, and they go ahead and they do the same types of things. Listen, just because something is extraordinary or appears supernatural doesn't make it right. Now, again, we believe in the supernatural. I see those things. I experience those things. I want us to experience those things, but that cannot be the end all. So I'm going to put all this in a sentence. I want you to write down this sentence. Spiritual activity is not necessarily godly activity. Spiritual activity is not necessarily godly activity. Just because someone has excitement and passion, just because someone has an experience, just because there's extraordinary things that are occurring, does not necessarily mean that it is from God. So, John understood this. Corinthius was a gentleman that was going all around Ephesus. He was a great orator. He was a great speaker. And the entire church began to follow and chase after him. And so John feels like he has to write this letter to correct some things and to get them to see that he actually is in the spirit of the Antichrist and that is the devil who is actively working against the Father.